Hello, everybody, and welcome to Micromobility World. I'm Julia Thane, and I'm going to be moderating our discussion today with Matthew Yglesias about the unpacking of the e-bike revolution. Matthew Yglesias is a political blogger, a columnist, and an author. He's written for publications like Slate and The Atlantic and about everything from monetary policy to parking reform. He co-founded the popular news site Vox Media, and today you can find his writing weekly in the slow, boring Substack. He's also the author of the book, 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger. Let's dive right in. So Matthew, I'm going to start with a bit of a personal question. I mean, from your Twitter tagline, you are an e-bike dad. That's the first thing that it says. And I wondered if you could take us through your personal journey of getting into e-bikes. What inspired you? What did you like about them?
What got me into bikes, I mean, I've been reading about them. I had some friends who have them and use them and have been enjoying them. But I had a change in my schedule that has led me to, I live in Washington, D.C. I live in a very walkable, transit-oriented neighborhood of D.C. But there was a physical therapist I started going to whose office is it's not that far from my house, but it's not walkable. It's not in my neighborhood and it's not on a metro line. And, so I was driving out there a couple times a week, and it was a little bit of a pain. You're moving this big vehicle. I'm there. I'm trying to make sure I'm fitting within the allowed parking window. There's a restaurant over there that I like. And so I say, well, I should stop in there for lunch, but then I got to get back out and get to the meter. And, I have my friends with the e-bikes, and I was like, this would be a much more practical way to make this trip of a few miles that, I don't need any cargo for. And what I really want to do is simplify the parking. And if I can get some, some exercise, some physical activity in with it as well, but why not? So I went and I bought one. I've got a Rad City bike, and it's a lot of fun, and once you have it, it's useful for lots and lots of different applications, which I think is, an important part of transportation economics, right? Which vehicle you have at your disposal is a big factor in terms of which is useful for which use cases. So I got it specifically to make this one kind of trip out to the Palisades. But once you have it, it's very practical for a kind of wide range of urban mobility needs.
That's really interesting, Matthew. And what I'm hearing from you is that it started with a practical decision, and then it was something that just became fun. And so you were able to use it for a variety of reasons. I want to get to this point about parking that you just made, and one of the practical reasons that you made the switch to an e-bike. A big theme in your book, in 1 Billion Americans, is the interplay between transportation and land use, and how you can't move more people in cities without rethinking things like parking, housing, and zoning. So, first question is really, how do you see the role of the car and now the electric SUV in American society? And how do you start to really roll back the supremacy of the car in urban planning?
Yeah, I mean, cars are obviously an incredibly useful technology. There's a reason why once cars are invented, once people become affluent enough, they want to buy cars. Cars are also they're large, right? And large cars are very large. And people want to be able to park their cars when they're driving them, because it's not useful if you can't park it. But we've developed in the United States, at least, a regulatory norm that says, well, we're going to require enough parking to come with all new construction so that everybody can park their giant cars around where everything is. And that meets a certain kind of baseline need, like, well, I need to have my car, and then I need a place to park the car. So we need the rule to be that you have to build all this parking. But it creates these very unpleasant neighborhoods that people don't like to be in nearly as much as they enjoy spending time in more traditional neighborhoods that don't have these huge agglomerations of parking. So, I don't think that we need to move to a world in which there isn't any parking anywhere or nobody is allowed to build it. It's practical in a lot of kinds of situations. But if you say, look, people should be allowed to build as much or as little parking as they think is suitable to the neighborhood, to the economics of the situation, then you get more pleasant places to be, even though it is going to be more challenging for some people to get there. But that then becomes an important reason to say, well, why do we need such a large vehicle, right? Now, there's a reason people have a desire for them, which is that sometimes you actually do need to carry incredibly large quantities of things from one place to another. But if you look, I mean, you go to any street in any city, you go to the highway, you look at the vehicles that are on the road, the vast majority of people at any given time are not using the capacity of their vehicle,
Right.
right? They have massively over purchased like transportation horsepower for what they're doing with the majority of their trips. They're, we're being overserved essentially. And then we are designing our whole cities around the idea that we need to move these very large, mostly empty vehicles through them. And if we can say instead, look, for most trips, you don't need a big vehicle. You should use a small vehicle. And then we can build for small vehicles and have just much more pleasant places. We can, say yes to growth. We can address a lot of things if we don't have our whole politics and society kind of dominated by this fear of parking.
Yeah, and Matthew, I'm starting to think about this question of the urban mobility dilemma and the fixed nature of urban form. I mean, in my day job, I work on land use and housing and transportation for the climate action nonprofit Rocky Mountain Institute. And we think a lot about how the decisions around investing in car-based infrastructure has really shaped the way in which our cities are in the US. And for that matter, has almost made us fixed and driven, and no pun intended, into electric cars, let alone cars themselves. So, what potential do you see for the electric bike, for other forms of micromobility vehicles, to start solving this urban mobility dilemma and to maybe take back that like fixed nature of urban form in U.S. cities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's just a lot of scope for saying we can have people start to get around places where parking scarcity already exists, which is true in older neighborhoods, using, micromobility solutions, using smaller vehicles, but also starting to say, look, like we don't need to build around the assumption that every trip needs to be done in a large car, right? If you read anything, conventional free market type stuff, right? People say, look, what's good about markets is they're adaptable and we can innovate, et cetera, et cetera. But transportation and land use evolve with each other, right? You look at any technology that's powerful. Railroads would not be useful if you didn't build communities around the train stations, right? If you had just said, well, we have this land use pattern from a time when there were no trains, and that's going to be fixed in place, even though we now have this technology, it wouldn't work. And again, cars, very useful. But if we didn't pave roads, right? If we said everything has to be the same as it was before cars, they wouldn't have been that useful. And what we have right now is land use frozen in place around a paradigm that assumes, well, we don't have any alternative means of transportation. And we need to relax that, and to say, look, we should let people experiment to some extent. I mean, I don't think we fully know the balance between bikes and scooters and electric vehicles, and maybe like little pod shaped electric vehicles have some potential. I think that, mobility as a service has become an important part of the micromobility world, but that could also move up into larger vehicles. So it could be an interplay between that, right? I mean, if you could take for every trip the vehicle that was appropriately sized to your actual needs for that actual trip, that would be great. Because what we have right now is we say, look, if one day in 100, I need to carry 4 people and 3 suitcases, that has to be my vehicle. And now I have this giant vehicle that carries 4 people and 3 suitcases, and I'm taking it, to the dentist, right? But like, why, right? Why do you need that? That's the
Right.
assumption that you have to buy one vehicle one time and then use it for everything, rather than saying, I'm going to take a vehicle that is appropriate to the trip that I'm currently. Now, of course, look, people don't want a garage that has like 12 different vehicles in it, right?
Or maybe they
But
do. Yeah.
well,
I know
but I mean, it's
our
just,
viewers will have.
I mean, I think these days, we're used to seeing more and more goods transformed into services, right? I mean, I have a lot of friends who take scooters around DC, and they don't own a scooter. The point is they pick one up when they need it. They ride it where they want to go. If it turns out that the weather is nicer in the afternoon, then they walk back home and instead of scooting. If one isn't available, they might take a bus, do something else like that. And, this is something about information technology has let us be much more flexible in terms of how do we find things. I remember when Zipcar was first invented, right? And it was laborious to use because it was like, well, how would you know where the zip cars are? But now everybody has mobile phones all the time. Everything has GPS in it. So it's easy to know where things are. So more things can be done casually. They can be done as services. And that then raises the question of like, well, why are we driving empty cars all the time? Why aren't we using these big vehicles when we need a big vehicle and using a smaller one, which is more fuel efficient? It can be more enjoyable. It can be easier to park. It has all these other kinds of advantages. And then it also becomes, a question of lifestyle on some level. I mean, like most people these days, care somewhat about my physical fitness, about my weight, about my appearance. And if you can build a little bit of physical activity into daily life without it being incredibly arduous, biking uphill is hard. You don't necessarily want to do that like wearing a suit on your way to a business meeting and you show up covered in sweat. But biking on flat ground, is easy. And it's a fun way to build a little bit of activity into your routine, right? And the e-bike lets you kind of have the best of both worlds in those regards, right? So we're innovating in the transportation space, but unless we get less prescriptive with our land use, we can't unlock the power of those innovations.
Yeah, and Matthew, you're bringing up a few different themes, and I want to go in a couple of different directions, starting with this question about shared versus owned. So you mentioned you live in DC. DC, in my mind, is actually one of the great US transportation cities. I'm just going to say that, and we'll see if you agree with it or not. But there's a great shared bike system. People are also choosing to buy e-bikes. Why? Across the US, we've seen that shared micromobility has really struggled pre and during and post pandemic. But privately owned micromobility is booming. So does that mean we're selfish? What do you see as the trends? Why are we going privately owned versus shared?
Well, I do think that one reason that privately owned was a good solution for me is that I have this garage out back of my house. So I have a good place to put it. And the question is, why do I have a garage in the back of my house? And the answer is, well, it was here when I bought it, but also the house is required to have not one, but two parking spaces.
Yeah.
If that was changed, right? Suppose I was allowed to convert that garage into an accessory dwelling unit. There would be very large financial upside to me to doing that, right? Then I wouldn't have a place to store my e-bike at night. And the sort of cost benefit of shared versus owned might switch for me, So I think that there's sort of constant feedback between these land use things and the transportation decisions that people made, because and I think in most of the country, having vehicle storage for a small vehicle is pretty easy. And so people are going to tend to prefer privately owned as long as they're not that expensive. But in other places, I grew up in Manhattan, and parking anything in Manhattan is very expensive. It is not typical for people there to have a private parking space. People's apartments tend to be quite on the small side. Space is very, very, very valuable. So I think that shared has a kind of an obvious use case. The more, the less sort of private space you have to yourself. And, I'm both glad to have my garage and then also sometimes embittered that I'm not allowed to turn it into something that would be more valuable to me and probably more valuable to the community. I mean, housing is quite scarce in the United States of America right now. I have a garage that contains a car that I don't use on most days. It contains an e-bike and it contains, I don't know, I've got a giant stack of paper towels I bought at Costco. But that's not like the high.
Don't we all?
It's not the highest and best use of scarce land in an in-demand neighborhood that has very high rents. So we're struggling with homelessness in DC, and it would be good to see more conversion of more spaces into dwelling for people. And I think that might lend itself to more of a use of shared.
Right. And ironically, this legacy of car-based infrastructure, so your garage, is the reason why you were able to have an e-bike. So
Yeah.
yeah, let's talk a little bit about just cars and car policy
Mhm.
in the US. I mean, historically, almost all transportation modes have been very heavily subsidized by the government. Here in the US, I mean, it's no surprise to anybody listening to this, nor to you, that the auto industry has been supported and bailed out numerous times. Now it's electric SUVs, because
Mhm.
we're not really talking about cars anymore. We're talking about much larger vehicles, are getting really
Mhm.
big subsidies. I mean, you said in one of your articles, there's never really been a concerted government push for e-bikes. Why?
Mhm.
Like, why do you think the owned micromobility market hasn't gotten that government support? What would happen if it did?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very deep legacy of political involvement with the auto industry in the United States, and it is hard to sort of break, right? There's a labor union issue where we have a largely non-union private sector in the United States, but the Midwestern-based auto industry is an important exception to that. So it is seen as important to the kind of larger labor community to specifically support the automobile industry. There's also a lot of identity kind of tied up with cars. I mean, one of the reasons I put e-bike dad there in my Twitter profile is, I am a dad. I have an e-bike. I have friends, other dads who ride their e-bikes. But trying to create a bit of sort of buzz and identity around different ways of getting around is a kind of an interesting project for me. But I mean, I do think that cities which have sort of more progressive politics that have greater, geographical constraints on what they're doing should be trying to lead on the bikes issue, and that's both a question of land use, which is very much under their own house, and then yeah, I mean they can provide subsidy if they think that cost is really a huge barrier. The flip side, of course, is an e-bike is I don't know, it's not a trivial expense. I mean, they cost a real amount of money, but they are much cheaper than cars and SUVs. So it's a very convenient, low cost alternative to people. And I think if you look at the whole suite of measures around micromobility and land use, right? You were talking about cost savings, right? You were talking
Mm,
about getting people into a lifestyle where their housing costs are lower because they don't need as much vehicle storage, where the vehicle they're using is cheaper because it's smaller, where the fueling needs are much lower. Ultimately, I think that a lot of people in the American environmental community have not fully run the numbers on
mm,
batteries,
yep.
on the
Yeah.
batteries are great.
Right.
And both electric cars and micromobility have been created by the falling cost of batteries. But the mineral resources that are consumed
Right.
in creating a very large number of very, very, very large batteries, are not trivial, right? It's better for the planet than burning fossil fuels indefinitely, but it's not nothing. There is
Right. Yeah.
there is a real difference between people mostly relying on small batteries and people mostly relying on enormous batteries. And when you look at the comprehensive environmental footprint, you start to see a very different picture. And, climate change is a really important issue. There has been a
Sure.
lot of very specific focus on CO2 emissions, but people were concerned about the environment before the specifics of the climate change issue came to the fore. And, there's just a broader kind of dimension of questions about, exactly how much lithium do we imagine digging up out of the ground? More. I mean, I think even if we're all e-bikes, we're going to need more battery factories. We're going to need more lithium. We're going to need more of that stuff. But you do want to think about like what is the comprehensive resource intensity and what are we really enabling, right? I mean,
Sure.
it's great to have we need freight in the world, right? We need to move like huge amounts of commodities around from place to place. So to the extent that we can electrify large vehicles to do that, to meet the needs of the trucking industry, like that's incredible, right? Or if we can move even bigger stuff. But the fact is that like most of the trips most of us take, we're moving one person and like maybe their laptop. right? Like you don't, it's incredibly wasteful, right? And so it's not conservation in the sense of asking people to do less with less. It's like get resources that are suited to what you are actually already doing, which is like mostly not carrying an SUV that's full of things.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, this question about the climate impacts of electric vehicles, of electric mobility, especially vis-a-vis a car, or for that matter, just walking, I think is a really important one. And agree that that's something that researchers, nonprofit organizations like, RMI are really only starting to uncover. Um, this fall, actually, sorry, not this fall, this winter, we're not in fall anymore. This winter, RMI is going to be putting out a piece just looking at the difference in emissions benefits between owning an electric vehicle, owning an e-bike, owning an EV plus an e-bike, or owning an internal combustion engine versus an e-bike. So I won't tease those results too much, but long story short, even when you look at life cycle emissions, there's certainly a lot of climate benefits from e-bikes. Matthew, in 1 Billion Americans, you talk a little bit about how climate isn't necessarily the framework for which we should be putting forward any solutions, including things like e-bikes. But I'm wondering, in this case, how much should people care about the climate impacts of e-bikes? How much is that a useful organizing principle for pushing forward e-bikes? How much should climate impacts be determining what sort of incentives are put in place for e-bikes, if any?
Well, I mean, look, if we're doing incentive programs for personal transportation with the Inflation Reduction Act includes significant electric vehicle title. And the goal of that title is to promote reduced carbon emissions. So if that's what you're doing, you owe it to yourself, you owe it to the world to do the math properly, right? In terms of what really are the benefits of this. The benefits of getting people to switch from internal combustion engine cars to electric cars are real. But the benefits of switching from an internal combustion engine car to an e-bike are much larger. And the fact that there's significant subsidy for the former, but none for the latter, that's just bad policymaking. On another level, like I don't think we're necessarily going to kind of carbon footprint scold people into redesigning their personal lifestyle. It's the subsidies is a technical matter, right? I mean, people at the Treasury Department, they need to write these regulations. EPA needs to look at it. They should do it correctly, right? And not just kind of assume that anything that's electric is equivalent. But as a community of people who care about these things, I mean, I think the points to make is that, look, we're trying to make people's lives better, right? We're trying to help you live a healthier existence. We're trying to say, look, we can have growth in our in-demand communities. There are certain cities in America. Denver, I know, right, is a place a lot of people have been moving there. A lot of people have been moving to Colorado. Colorado is a beautiful state, right? That's a big part of the reason that people want to go there. And then the question is like, well, how will Colorado accommodate that growth? Will they have a level of sprawl that destroys the beauty of the landscape that drew people there in the first place? Will they say, no, you can't move here. We're not going to build more housing for people. This is going to be a gated community. If your parents bought a place here, good for you. And if not, you're locked out. Or are we going to say, look, like we can build infill and we can, have more people within the footprint that already exists, which is going to create a great place for people to live that combines the virtues of natural landscape with the sort of dense urban amenities and great lifestyle options there. But people are going to say, if you start talking about density and infill, they say, like, where am I going to park? You can get very ideological, academic arguments about this, but real people who every day are getting in their car and relying on their car to get to the grocery store, to get to the doctor's office, to get to their kids' school, they don't want changes to their community that are going to make it impossible for them to get around. And the fact that we have smaller vehicles that can meet most of these transportation needs, that we don't have to force you into, but to say, look, the infrastructure should allow you to do it. You should not be required to have cars to get around. You shouldn't be required to have huge parking lots everywhere. We can build a better, nicer place for you and your family to live in, which is going to mean, look, it's going to be easier to have kids, or for kids to grow up and live in neighborhoods that they grew up in, that we can have a society that has room for all of us, because it doesn't have to have like 12 acres of parking for every person.
Sure.
It's just it's an important part of just like having a nicer future, a thriving set of communities.
You talked a little bit about Denver, and I know you were giving the example of people moving to Denver, people moving to Colorado, it just being a nice
Mhm.
place to live. But of course, in the e-bike world, Denver is rising to the top because the city of Denver has offered incentives and subsidies and instant rebates for people to be able to purchase e-bikes and cargo bikes. And in the past, year that they've been doing it, 6 months, a year that they've been doing it, have been oversubscribed every month. I think one of
Mhm.
the months that they did it, within 7 minutes, all of the rebates had been claimed. And now they're relaunching it in January with a slightly different program. But I'm curious, what cities and states do you see doing this combination of e-bike incentives or bike infrastructure and land use well? How do you think they should be doing it? Where besides Denver should really be investing in the same types of changes?
Everything's been a bit of a mixed bag in terms of different kinds of reforms in the United States. California, just sort of this past year, pushed through a lot of ambitious land use reforms that I think are really, really good. I think that they have not done anything really big on the transportation side, but that would be the sort of next logical step for them. You know, as a lifelong East Coast resident, I just always find California to be the greatest tragedy. It's like it's
Why?
it well, because it's insane that like in Boston we have the highest number of people walking to work in these like
Mm.
awful winters with ice everywhere, and then you go to Los Angeles and you walk in a circle around the block and you're like, this is amazing, but you can't go anywhere, right? What would be a better place than Southern California to
I
do
mean, I agree. Yeah.
95% of your
Being based in Los
travel on
Angeles.
foot and
Yeah.
on bicycle, right?
Right, right.
That's fantastic. And I think it's such a clear win there again to just paint a picture to people of, it's like, yes, it's good for the environment, but like a better lifestyle that fully takes advantage of the incredible natural amenities that exist there, right? All over the East Coast, Kathy Hochul in New York just proposed in early January a very ambitious set of housing reforms for the state that, I don't know where they will go in the legislature, but it's something she's pushing for. But the first thing that's going to come to everybody's mind is say, look, you're talking about adding more housing on Long Island, talking about adding more housing in Westchester. What's going to happen to traffic? What's going to happen to parking? Because,
Mm-hmm.
the traffic situation on Long Island is quite bad. And she can say, look, well, we're going to increase LIRR service. So, people who are commuting into the Manhattan Central Business District can ride the commuter rail. They can ride the train, which is totally true. That's great. But, most people who live in the suburbs don't commute to office jobs in the central city. They do service sector work in the suburbs, right? They are providing medical care or childcare. They're doing local things in the communities where they live. They care about the traffic. They care about the parking, and you need to offer them solutions on the transportation side. They can say, not everybody, not all the time. Like, look, if what you're actually doing is loading up the whole family for a trip, or you're trying to haul a sofa, like, of course, like, don't put a couch on your bicycle. But like, what is it that you're really doing most of the time. And it's just great, when you see people with a couple of kids in the little kid bike car seats and they're cruising along and the kids are having fun and their parents are getting some exercise and they can roll right up to the school door and let them off instead of standing in some huge line with tailpipe emissions everywhere. Like, that's just nice. That's good for people. And everyone who is taking action on housing is going to face these questions about transportation and should be putting forward the opportunity, at least, for people to try out micromobility, which I think goes viral. It's when you see other people doing it, you start saying, oh, that looks cool. Let me
Yeah.
give it a try.
Yeah, yeah. And this gets to this question about micromobility for all. I mean, some of the use cases and, people examples that you've given over the course of this conversation really speaks to the potential universality of the application of e-bikes. I mean, people can use them for a variety of reasons. But as we've seen in Denver, one of the things that has been most helpful in terms of structuring the incentives is structuring them based on income and being able to have higher incentives for folks with lower incomes and vice versa. I mean, question for you is, how do we get to micromobility for all? Does it even matter? And, who cares about this? Who should care about this? And who doesn't?
I mean, I don't know. It's a hard question.
You have to have an opinion about this.
I mean, I think absolutely that, targeting subsidy at people at the low end, it makes sense from a basic standpoint of fairness. It's a lower cost option, so you don't necessarily need subsidy for more affluent types of families. I do think also, though, that you don't want, a car to an extent in most of the world is a status symbol, among other things, right? I mean, it's a practical transportation tool, but it also says, look, I am wealthy enough that I can afford this, right? I am not limited to riding the bus or to riding a moped, right? I mean, so different countries are different. The United States is very rich and almost everybody has a car. You go to Southern Europe and you see lots of people riding around on gas powered mopeds all the time, and that's not a environmental choice necessarily. It's about
Right.
the economics of Portugal, right? And so to an extent there, if you become wealthy enough to buy a car, you want to do it not just for the practical value, but to show that you have ascended to a certain point in landscape. In the United States, I think we don't want to code micromobility as like a poverty option, right? Like, you want to say this is a good lifestyle amenity, and you don't want to make it a snob thing. You want it to be something that's accessible to everybody. But the fact is, I mean, e-bikes are so much cheaper than the typical car. I mean, the typical American family has not just one, but two cars that are much more expensive than an e-bike. So, I mean, I worry more about maintaining a sort of a positive brand concept around the whole idea. But it may be different in different parts of the world, where automobile and ownership is lower and where you're talking about just sort of upgrading what people are doing from things that are very loud, that are very polluting, and just frankly less practical than e-bikes that exist.
One of the things that makes me think of is, I've just spent the past weekend testing out different e-bikes because I'm looking at making, and this is a little bit embarrassing considering how many micromobility conferences and things that I do, but I'm looking at purchasing my first e-bike. And
there you go.
there I go. And it's been fascinating, basically going from some of the premium e-bike models like Cake. Ride Cake. I don't know if you've tried out any of their vehicles, but they're amazing, to some of the other options. And I'll just say, one of the things that's been impressive to me about micromobility overall is just the breadth, depth, number of use cases that micromobility vehicles have been able to fulfill. So I want to ask a question actually about e-bike companies. And again, in 1 billion Americans, you talk about how we can get to 1 billion Americans by birthing additional people, by allowing folks to immigrate here. how does that theory extend to companies and especially e-bike companies? I mean, right now we've got a handful of US based companies, and there's a number of micromobility companies that are out of Turkey or East Africa or Europe and India, and really are, I would say, sort of leapfrogging the US in terms of the number and type of micromobility companies. Why is that? How could we get to, I don't want to say 1 billion micromobility companies, but like how would we get to just a greater base of companies here in the US?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's a very chaotic landscape right now in which both, an advantage for consumers is that there are a lot of companies selling e-bikes, and the barriers to entry of getting into manufacturing and selling e-bikes are relatively low compared to, starting a car company. That also means it's a little bit confusing from a consumer
Mm,
landscape. It's a little bit challenging. I was suffering decision paralysis for a while
hmm.
before I got
Yeah,
my
say more
first
about
e-bike.
that. Yeah.
Because I was like, okay, I should get an e-bike. And then it was like, well, which kind should I get? And I looked around at a few, and there were a few that seemed pretty good, but I wasn't really sure which was best. And also I knew that I hadn't investigated all of the options. And I was thinking, well, I got to do more research. I got to do more research. And eventually a friend of mine was like, I don't know, like, don't be dumb. Just get one. That seems like it would be good. And right. Well, which is true, right? But it's different from how I make most, major purchases, right? When I needed to get a refrigerator, I looked at a pretty small number of major appliance manufacturers who sell fridges in the United States, and I could say, look, I need one that fits the space in my kitchen. So that cut out a few. And, I really had kicked the tires on all the possible options. Whereas I bought an e-bike not without looking into it. I mean, I got one that had good reviews, et cetera, but it was not exhaustive. I mean, I had never heard of this company, Cake, that you just mentioned,
Yeah, got to
and
check out Ride Review.
yeah. So it would be easier, right, if there were like 10 companies that are making e-bikes to feel like you fully know and fully understand the landscape. At the same time, micromobility is diverse, which is one of the real strengths of the ecosystem, right? I mean, you can get bikes that are really for off-road, that are really for commuting, that are really for cargo. You can get bikes that are cheap. You can get bikes that are expensive. It depends on what you need. And having the vehicle that suits your specific needs is a big part of the appeal in this place. So I wouldn't want to cut it down or anything like that. Um, you know, Light manufacturing is just not necessarily the United States of America's comparative
Mm,
advantage in the
sure.
universe. But we have this big national push right now to try to develop a bigger battery industry, which fundamentally is the sort of underlying enabling technology here that has, because a bicycle is a relatively simple kind of machine, right? Whereas the batteries are somewhat more complex, even though they're a little bit commoditized. So, I don't know exactly if the future is necessarily us as a huge manufacturing hub for this
Interesting.
kind of
Yeah.
thing. It might be, but I think it may just not be the most realistic aspiration.
Where else do you think the US might be the preeminent whatever? If we're not going to be the preeminent manufacturer or the preeminent producer, could we be the preeminent consumer, software supplier? Where else might
Well,
we get
I mean,
in?
absolutely. I mean, software is, become the American economy's bread and butter in a lot
Hmm.
of ways. And I think thinking about transportation as a nexus of different kinds of vehicles that suit different kinds of needs is something that American companies have been toying with in a lot of different levels. And such Uber, once you think about it, is like such a crude idea on some level, right?
Hmm.
Like it's
I
like
don't know that they would love that description of it. Yeah.
no, but I mean, but it's when it first came out, it was like such a bolt of lightning into the universe,
Hmm.
right? But it was like, look, the phone knows where I am and it knows where the drivers are. So it could just connect me at an arbitrary location to another person and relative to doing a taxi dispatch. And it is so much more seamless. And you can just like summon this car and it comes at your door. But they're using the same cars everybody has been driving around all the time.
Yeah.
So we go from uh one person driving a car that is like 80% empty to now there's two of us in the car and it's only 65% empty. But it's still the question of like why are we doing this? Like why are we have empty cars around all over the place, right? And so the question of like matching rides to what it is you actually need is a complicated logistical subject, right? That fundamentally, I think, is a largely software and IT problem rather than a sort of a vehicle manufacturing problem, right? We can make in the micromobility world has filled in this whole range of possible use cases with different kinds of vehicles. But what would really kind of supercharge that is, do we have the software and the logistics to match people with vehicles and uses, right? So that we are getting what we need all the time when we need it, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that is a sort of a complicated high-end computery question that I think American companies have had a lot of experience in dealing with sort of related kinds of problems.
Yeah. To that point, though, I mean, if we were to have this conversation 5 years ago, I think mobility as a service would have been something that we spent most of the conversation talking about. The
Hmm.
types of ride matching, vehicle matching that you were speaking about is exactly what that vision was 5, 10 years ago, even. And what we
Hmm.
found is that a combination of the fragmentation of the industry and the inability of the industry to be able to share data with each other, or for that matter, to integrate
Yes.
software systems, made mass almost impossible. And then when
Hmm.
each company tried to do it on their own, Uber, for example, offering multiple options or doing some level of transit integration, even then they ran into some issues. So it seemed like there was this sort of promise of mass, but then under delivery of it. Do you think we'll see the revival of that? How might e-bikes, shared micromobility, even owned micromobility start to fit back into this question of mass or software powered mobility
Yeah,
options?
well, I think the most basic level is that large vehicles as a service let
Hmm,
owning your own micromobility
yeah.
vehicle uh, sort of work for you, right? I mean,
Yep.
if you don't have, right, because there's always they talk about this in the just like in the electric car world, right? The range anxiety kind of problem, and you say, look, like you have a person and most of the time they're taking short trips. So like, can't I just like build a car for you that suits your short trips? But people are like, no, because once every 3 weeks, like I want to go apple picking or something, and I don't want to run on batteries, right? Um, One way that Uber was transformative for me in DC is that it let a lot of people let go of the idea that they needed a car for
Mm,
occasional trips, right? So that if you could do 85% of your trips on an e-bike, then you don't need to own a car for the other 15% of trips, right? If you can go take an Uber. One reason that I don't think you see a lot of adoption of that model in most American cities is that the upside to giving up your car is low if you're going to have all the parking spaces anyway. Right. That's
mm,
why I always loop back to land use, because
mm,
land space is the scarcest commodity in all of these
mm,
places. Right. So shifting to smaller vehicles and to just sort of spot use of the big vehicles has incredible benefits in terms of letting you take up less space. But you need to be able to realize the benefits. I mean, I've been talking about my garage. I was talking about ADUs. But even just like less grandiosely, I think lots of people would like to have a bigger house, right? But in at least in my neighborhood, you are not allowed to swallow up your parking space with your house. It has to be a parking space, and it has to be a parking space even if you don't have a car. Right?
yeah.
You're not allowed to say, look, I don't have a car. I don't need a street parking permit. I should be allowed to get rid of my parking space. You're also not allowed to say, I'm going to convert this. It's going to be e-bike parking for the whole block. because these things
Yeah.
are smaller, but like you can't do that either, right? So we have this regulatory blockage of sort of reaping the big financial upsides of going smaller. And that has meant that there's a lot of kind of toy business models that you can think about, but that they don't really present the full upside to people that ought to be there. So that's part of the change that I've been interested in, since before any of these technologies existed, but it's just to say, look, we have dynamism and we have uncertainty in the transportation space. But the point of transportation is to complement the built environment.
Mm,
And if we don't allow the built environment to evolve, then the transportation innovation never reaches its real potential. And we just don't know where it can go.
yeah. I mean, picking up on a few of the threads that you started to unweave. I don't remember the right verb there. But one of the things that we've been talking about over the past couple of micromobility conferences is just this idea of moving towards shared cars and privately owned micromobility. Speaking to the use cases and the reasons why you would do that, just from a personal consumer, and also just from a space perspective in cities in particular. But of course, what you're alluding to is that there's this rigidity of policy, the regulatory environment, not to mention the rigidity of the actual urban form that's in some ways almost preventing that from happening. So question to you, Matthew, is, in terms of land use and housing, you've framed it as like, you can't have micromobility without land use and housing. Like there's sort of two sides of the same coin. Especially for the audience of Micromobility World, what should they do about that? Like how do micromobility advocates get involved in land use and housing? Is there a place to do that? Is it the right thing to do? What are your thoughts?
So we have YIMBY, it's Yes in My Backyard organizations in most major American cities right now that, I would encourage people to look up. There's a kind of umbrella group, YIMBY Action. So these are land use reform organizations. They have had some success in pushing change. It would be great to see people who are interested in micromobility sort of engage with those groups and what it is they do. One reason, just like it's good, it's important, it has an important tie-in to micromobility. The second is, people are naturally suspicious of any kind of organization and sort of reform group and like what's going on here. And in some ways it would be good to have people say, look, like, yeah, these people, like they want to sell you e-bikes. Like that's why they want more people to come live here, because it's like perfectly good reason, e-bikes are crushing it in Denver, and they would crush it even more if even more people could come to Denver, and also more people will be able to fit
Sure.
in the city if these things are smaller, right? I mean, communities need boosters around these things. So like this is great, right? A kind of, there's a strain of optimism that is really deep in American culture and society. But there's also a strain of car orientation that's very strong in American society.
Those two are not the same, yeah.
Well, no, but they've actually collided with each other to the point where people have started to get like really down on the idea of growth in their community because it's going to put more cars on the road, or it's going to, like how am I going to get to the supermarket, right? And it's like the solution here is land use reform and micromobility to let us be like the kind of people who, as Americans, I think we want to be, which is people who are excited about our country, about our state, about our city, about our community, who want more people to come, who want to see more things going on, who want to believe we have the possibility to do more. And that just means, taking geography seriously, geometry seriously, and to say, look, if everybody all the time is carting empty space with them wherever they go, like we don't fit, and we become this very sort of pessimistic zero sum, oh my god, don't let them build an apartment there kind of people, which is like a bummer. And I don't think that's who any of us really want to be.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things that you're talking about get positioned as left versus right issues.
Hmm.
And especially with micromobility industries, we've been trying to avoid any partisanship or,
Hmm.
partisanship divide. How do you think micromobility advocates can broaden their political coalition? And, how would you frame this issue so you could appeal to most voters?
I mean, I think to some extent you have to listen
Hmm.
to what it is people say, and listen to what conservatives have to say, and try to echo them, and try to find things that they're interested in. But you know, uh, there's a narrative of freedom that is powerful across parties in the United States of America, and I think that's just the important point to emphasize, that micromobility is freedom itself on a lot of levels. It's the ability to get more places, to fit into more spots, to take yourself into new dimensions, but also the policy change we need is really not to make people you know, go around in a cargo bike, but it is to let people say,
Yeah.
um, I can use this. Like I can reuse my space for other things because I have these micromobility solutions, but the government is not letting me. That planners sat down sometime in 1964 and were like, this is how many cars everybody needs. This is how everything has to work. And we're here, decades later. Technology has dramatically altered, and we haven't updated any of these rules in this kind of way. And it's a classic story. It connects absolutely to things progressives care about, in terms of the environment, but these are just costly economic regulation. They are leading to a lot of waste of steel, a lot of waste
Hmm.
of energy, a lot of waste of space, and it is preventing us from taking advantage of changes and entrepreneurial activity and all kinds of other good things that conservatives care about.
And based on what you just said, why don't you think more libertarians or folks on the right are shouting for micromobility solutions that depend less on government intervention than, automobiles, electric automobiles, even public transit, transportation modes?
Well, I don't know. I got to tell you, just later tonight, I'm going to a parking reform happy hour that is
Oh,
happening in downtown
exciting.
Washington, D.C. It
Yeah.
is
The place
being
to
it is
be.
being
Yeah.
sponsored by some people from some center right organizations
Hmm.
at the Mercatus Center, and so we're working on it, right?
Okay.
We're trying to build bridges here. I look, there's a big divide in American politics based on geography, right? You look at a map of anywhere in the country, a very conservative place. My wife's parents live in sort of Western Texas, in the Hill Country, and so you look at a precinct map out there, and it's deep, 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 deep red. But then you look at the town of Kerrville, which is not a big
Hmm.
city by any means, but it's a town. You look at the precinct that's like downtown Kerrville, and it's faint blue. Like it's the
Hmm.
only island of liberals is the people who live in town in this rural, very conservative part of the state. So naturally, anything that relates to city living, or like where space is at a premium, comes to be associated with liberals and sort of left progressive politics, which is fine. But it is important to say, look, like on the merits, there's a lot of libertarian strands to this. We are talking about getting away from a prescriptive planning regime and being more open to innovation and disruptors and things here, and just remembering to speak that language a little bit so that voters who don't as naturally affiliate with the idea of oh, I saw these pictures of Copenhagen and it looked nice, right? Because like who that message appeals to is different from the person who says, like, we don't need the big government telling us,
Right.
what we need in our parking garage. But it's the same message, really, for everyone, is that we can have a more diverse set of transportation options, and a wealthier, more dynamic society.
Yeah, and Matthew, maybe one final question before I ask you one final question. So one penultimate
Mhm.
question, and thank you again for joining us for this discussion. It's been absolutely fascinating hearing your perspective on both being an e-bike dad and then also just on the policies and things we need to do. So you've mentioned parking reform, you've mentioned land use, you've mentioned
Mhm.
housing, even some incentives. But what else? Are there any other policy measures that you think would be the most successful at shifting people away from cars and towards micromobility?
I mean, I do think land use is key, but as these EV incentives get bigger and start rolling out more, we really need to look more carefully at what we are incentivizing and why, and are we getting the numbers right on that to say, well, we need a larger incentive for electric vehicles because they're more expensive, which I think is the logic Congress is working with.
Hmm.
Like that doesn't really make sense, right? The incentive should
Mm,
be scaled to the social benefits, not vice versa. I don't really think Congress got that balance right in Inflation Reduction Act, and uh, it's something that we're going to need the federal government to look at, because if you have an incentive to buy an electric vehicle that is actually larger than the total cost of a mid-range e-bike, right? That's a huge thumb on the scales against e-bike manufacturers that we really should not have.
yeah, interesting. And I mean, just a couple of months ago, Secretary Buttigieg came out and said, we didn't get the e-bike tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act. We're probably not going to get it this year. And I think everybody in the micromobility industry did just a huge sigh of like, oh gosh, again, really looking for somebody to pick up the political mantle of e-bike tax credits or bike policy writ large in the federal government now that Earl Blumenauer has left.
Yes.
Yeah, right, leaving a huge vacuum, unfortunately. So again, Matthew, really thank you for joining us and for sharing your experience about being an e-bike dad, which before you had described what it actually meant, I was thinking of like, Daenerys Targaryen being the mother of
Oh yeah,
dragons,
no,
and
no, I
you
am I
guys
am
are
not I am
really
not the father of e-bikes.
So Matthew, one of the things that we've done as part of Micromobility World is launch the Riders' Choice Awards. I don't know if you've voted yet or would vote, but a series of awards basically for the top everything in the micromobility industry. So I'm going to ask you three of your tops. What's your top e-bike? What's your top e-bike for dads? And who's the top e-bike dad?
you know, I really, what do I say? I have enjoyed my Rad City experience with them as
Okay.
a company. The Rad Wagon seems is a very dad friendly. It's good for touting kid.
For all the dads out there, yeah.
You can move a lot there. My friend Tom was my e-bike inspiration. So he's not really involved in the policy world at all, but he's been an important bike influencer in my life. So
Oh,
I'll
okay.
credit to him.
Here's to Tom. Thank you
Yeah.
again. Really appreciate it. And we'll hope to see you out there riding your e-bike in DC.
Okay. Thank you.